It looks like we are live. Give folks a few more moments to join, but welcome to the fourth session of the day. This session's on the role of partnerships and restructuring for rural hospitals. Stroudwater is thrilled to be joined by our friends at Waldrop Wall Babcock and Bailey, a law firm in North Carolina. Today, you've got myself, Claire Kelly. If you haven't seen me in other sessions today, I'm a senior consultant with Stroudwater Associates. I've been with the firm for about 10 years and specialize in all things rural strategy, whether that's partnerships or physician strategy. And I'll let my good friend Jennifer Lyday introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today. My name is Jennifer Lyday, and I am a partner at Waldrop Wall, Babcock and Bailey in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We also have a Raleigh office. I've gotten to work with the Stroudwater team on several engagements, and I love working with them. And I was just so excited to be able to take them up on this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is what the restructuring world can do for struggling rural hospitals.
Awesome. Thanks, Jennifer. So, to kick us off, I think we're going to talk about signs of distress and resulting strategic options. A lot of these slides you may have seen in other presentations today, but we want to re-emphasize them for the context of talking about restructuring and bankruptcy. Time is never a neutral factor. Again, this is a really common saying at Stroudwater, and this is you don't want to wait until you're absolutely distressed to pursue a performance improvement opportunity or to evaluate strategic options. A lot of folks say to us, man, I really wish we did this 2 years ago. And frankly, doing this when you're in a stressed or even stable position, you're coming at it with so much more leverage. You're able to take advantage of those performance improvement initiatives, and you're able to come at it with a sense of being able to say no to some strategic options where if you're coming at it from a distressed perspective and you've waited too long, you may not have the option to say no, and your strategic options become limited. And this is exemplified by kind of this years before hospital closure chart that I know folks have seen earlier today. Again, understanding that really that cutoff is about 3 years prior to closure where that decline starts to happen. So 8 to 3 years prior to closure is really that key zone to start working on those performance improvement activities and evaluating your strategic options to understand what's the best path forward. Where are you on that level of stressed, stable, or distressed, and what can we take advantage of here?
Yeah, I think Claire, I'm sure we'll talk about this more as we go along, but I mean, I cannot emphasize the importance of this slide enough, not just from an operational improvement perspective, but also from a restructuring perspective. Because I don't know how many times folks come to us and they think of, bankruptcy professionals as, last resorts when they've tried everything else and they're like a month away from running out of cash to pay payroll. And then they come to us as if we have a magic wand. Unfortunately, I do not have a magic wand. And bankruptcy is not the end all, be all salvation for a hospital that has run out of cash. But as we'll talk more as these slides progress, bankruptcy can be a very useful tool for a hospital that is more in that 3 to 8 year window. But certainly that 1, 2 year window would be great. 6 months window, maybe. But like the earlier, the better, the more options you have. But I don't know how many times folks have come to me. In fact, I've gone to some folks, I've been proactive and I've said, it looks like, based on everything in the marketplace, it tells me you might need to talk to me or someone like me. And then they say, oh, no, no, we're fine. We're fine. But then they come see me. And I wish they had taken me up on my offer a year, 2 years before that.
I couldn't agree more. And I think when you're talking about performance improvement too, there are certain performance improvement mechanisms that can take effect in 6 months versus 2 years. And so if you're not factoring that into the equation as well, again, it's really the sooner the better on a lot of these initiatives. To at least, and if nothing else, to be educated on what the gaps are and what you need to do. So just as a refresher, when we talk about stable, stressed, and distressed, a stable organization is one that we'd consider to have consistent margins, growing top line revenue. They can reinvest in their asset base. They can do those capital improvement projects. They can grow service lines. Whereas if we move into stress, you're starting to get 2+ years of declining margins, 2+ years of flat top line revenue. You're maybe only able to execute on a few of those capital improvement projects, if any, and you're starting to kind of feel those effects of not being able to fully reinvest in your asset base. And moving into distressed, you're getting that 3+ years of declining or negative margins, 3+ years of flat or decreasing top line revenue. And God forbid you start to get to those cost cutting measures that can impact core programs. You're having to make that difficult decision of, are we going to make payroll at the end of the month? You don't want to get to that point. So understanding where you fall on this scale is really important as a system moving forward and as an organization. So this brings us to our first polling question. How stressed is your organization? Are they distressed? Are you stressed? Are you stable? Do you not know? Give folks a few more seconds to respond.
Yeah, you were going through the stable, stressed, and distressed. Um, I can't tell you the number of folks who are stressed and think they're stable
Yeah.
because they're used to that level of stress and that's become normal to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So
And they
we
don't
have
see the
about,
need for and even if they think that they're stressed, they don't think that there's really anything that you can do at that point or that you don't need to do anything until you get to distressed.
yeah, agree. I'm going to end our poll, and it looks like 2/3 would label themselves as a stressed organization and about 1/3 as a stable organization. So if you're in that stressed sphere, what does that mean in terms of strategic options that are available to you? Number one, operational improvements again, do those performance improvement initiatives regardless of where you're at. Make sure that you are increasing your operational position. Partnership opportunities, we've talked a lot about this today, seeing if you can align with the larger system to improve cost efficiencies and improve reimbursement. And then what we're going to be focusing on for the rest of this presentation is bankruptcy as a restructuring tool, how to restructure those debt obligations and make sure, that you can use this tool in concert with a partnership. You can use it as leverage to have enhanced negotiations and become more attractive to potential partners. And the final note I'll make before handing it over to Jennifer is about board responsibility. Fiduciary duties of board members, is to identify stress, evaluate risk, and to understand where you fall, and support leadership in exploring all viable strategic options. So an understanding that it's part of your duty if you're a board member and on this presentation to have the education and the background on these concepts and to evaluate the risk of your organization, to know the stress of your organization, and to be able to understand all the strategic options that are in front of you as an organization. And with that, I'll pass it off to Jennifer.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Um, Before we kind of, oh, we're already at polling question number two.
Yes.
Well, hold on. I have a wait. Okay, hold on. All right. So polling question number two is, how well does your organization understand bankruptcy? Ooh. And the options are limited knowledge, not at all, somewhat have looked into it previously, and very well have gone through the process. While you guys are answering that program or that question, I was just going to say, educating board members on their responsibility to, to take the steps and be aware of the issues that Claire mentioned earlier is so important. And we love speaking to boards about those obligations because, in many of these rural hospitals, and you probably all know, the board members are often community members who are, not necessarily financial wizards or are, really, really educated when it comes to these types of issues. And so, I think it's very important to recognize that there are these duties and that they include looking at all options um, because, there are a lot of stakeholders and sometimes board members are so focused on keeping the hospital exactly the way it is and keeping it entirely independent. And that being the goal actually conflicts with some of the other fiduciary duties of the board. And so I just cannot emphasize that enough as well, that you guys are really participating in this is exactly the kind of thing you need to do. Okay, so we had or the actually 100% say limited knowledge about bankruptcy. So I'm kind of glad about that because I'm going to, spend the next, 30, 28 minutes or so talking about bankruptcy and what the options are and what that might mean for your, rural hospital. So this slide talks really about how bankruptcy can help a distressed rural hospital. And there are a lot of benefits that bankruptcy, specifically can provide to a hospital. And I like to say that there are problems that bankruptcy can really help with and can really provide solutions for. And then there are problems that bankruptcy can't help with as much. And so that is one reason why it matters that you have some runway before you go into a bankruptcy process. Because bankruptcy, for one, is terrible at printing money. So bankruptcy cannot give you money in and of itself. In fact, it does cost money to go through a Chapter 11 restructuring. You do have to pay professionals to take advantage of the benefits of bankruptcy. And so that's one reason why you can't wait till the very last minute to take advantage of this process. But things that it can do, it's very good at helping you to discharge unsecured trade debt. If you have been kind of accumulating trade debt over the long haul, let's say before you implemented these cost saving or revenue operational improvements, let's say you had all of this trade debt that now into the future is not going to be a big problem because you've done some great cost saving efficiencies, you've partnered with someone, you've got your supply costs down. You've got some of those things now. You've increased your revenue, by getting into better provider agreements. But you have this kind of old trade debt that if you keep having to pay on that old trade debt, it's going to cut into your margins, cut into your bottom line, and you'd really like just a fresh start because you've made a lot of improvements and you hate being burdened with that old trade debt. Um, Bankruptcy is a great option for getting rid of old trade debt, old unsecured debt, where you've already made some improvements, or you've made some improvements, but bankruptcy will allow you to make some other improvements and you need to get rid of old trade debt. Some improvements that bankruptcy can allow you to do is to get rid of burdensome contracts and leases. So let's say that, ever since you entered into that 10-year lease of, that building that you don't really use, and, you thought you were going to get a great profit margin from this building, but, it turned out to just not be a good investment, and you want to get out of that lease. Bankruptcy can allow you to get out of that burdensome lease or burdensome contract, and again, help your bottom line. Also, it'll give you the automatic stay, which is a very, very important benefit of bankruptcy, especially if you've got some of those old trade vendors that have started filing lawsuits against you. If you want to avoid those litigation expenses of, hiring your lawyers to fight each little piece of litigation, the automatic stay stops all of that litigation in its tracks, and it funnels those claims to the bankruptcy court, and those creditors then file bankruptcy claims, and it's dealt with through the bankruptcy process. But you don't have to pay lawyers to keep fighting each individual lawsuit. Another really, really important benefit of bankruptcy has to deal with your secured debt. So, think about your big bank. If you have a bank like an operating line, or let's say you took out a $100 million loan from a from HUD to build a hospital wing, but you've realized that the amount of debt that you owe is it exceeds the value of the collateral. That happens depending on how the real property prices are going. That can at different points be very important, but it allows you to, we call it cram down in the bankruptcy world. You cram down the amount of your secured debt to the value of your collateral. And so then you can often lower the overall amount of your debt. But even if you can't lower the amount of your debt, you can do other things like stretch it out or change the interest rate, or you just otherwise kind of restructure the debt in a way that makes your debt service payment more manageable. And so if your secured debt and financing your secured debt is a real problem for your organization, bankruptcy may be a way to make that payment more feasible, more doable on a monthly basis. And then another important benefit goes very well with the partnership discussion. Often, I've heard some people say, well, no one wants to partner with me because I have all this old trade debt, or I have this loan that is just really, doesn't look good on my balance sheet. Well, sometimes you can use bankruptcy to make yourself a more attractive partner, or you can, if the partnership you're looking at is a sale of your assets to a larger entity, they can buy that free and clear of all of your obligations. So you can see how, oh, this rural hospital was not really an attractive merger partner prior to the bankruptcy. But if we're only taking the good parts and leaving all the negative parts, it can become a much more attractive, um, uh, merger partner. So those are some of the kind of real key benefits. And I think the final bullet point there on this slide is very important. Bankruptcy is by no means a remedy for all financial problems, but it can provide a hospital with the opportunity to correct a struggling course and address accumulated liabilities. Yep, that's a very good summary. Okay, so this slide really focuses on the two major types of hospital bankruptcies that we see. Now, the differences are kind of very simple. Chapter 7 liquidations are for the people that came to me 30 days before they've missed payroll, or the hospitals that really have no options and are going to be closing. That I hope none of you ever consider. Chapter 7 is just a handing the keys to a Chapter 7 trustee. The hospital will close, and then the assets will be liquidated by a trustee piecemeal. The hospital will not be sold as a going concern. They will just close and then, sell the assets as a, non-operating hospital to the highest bidder. What we're really talking about when we're saying bankruptcy is a tool that rural hospitals who are stressed need to consider is the Chapter 11 reorganization process. And we call it a Chapter 11 reorganization because, the idea is for the hospital to continue as a going concern through the entire process. So these are hospitals that are operating and will continue to be operating during the entire process. And just during the course of the Chapter 11, there will be the creation of a plan to repay certain creditors in certain ways that gets approved by the court, with the goal of basically that plan governing the repayment obligations of this hospital over time. And so your goal is to exit bankruptcy after that plan is approved by the court. And then going forward, you're not bound by all your other obligations, your old obligations. You're governed by this new plan that tells you who you need to pay. Yes, there are no debt limits for Chapter 11. If you've heard, of debt limits in the bankruptcy process, there is a special kind of small business bankruptcy called Subchapter 5, but it's for debtors with really, less than $3 million in debt. And so that's really not going to be probably any of even our rural hospitals. So we're thinking, real Chapter 11, actual Chapter 11 reorganizations. And just to be clear, you can also use a Chapter 11 if your goal is to sell to a partner. We call that a liquidating Chapter 11. But the difference between this type of bankruptcy and the Chapter 7 liquidation is that in the Chapter 11 that's liquidating, it's a going concern. The hospital never stops, and the partnership, the sale occurs, but the hospital never stops operating. And so you can use the Chapter 11 process either to liquidate or to restructure, to reorganize. Okay, so this slide just takes us through a little bit of the Chapter 11 process. Um, so the process starts now. I say the process starts with the filing of a bankruptcy petition. That's actually more like the middle of the process, because there is a lot of pre-planning that goes into the filing of a bankruptcy petition, especially for an organization as complex as an operating hospital. So this is another reason why you cannot come to a bankruptcy professional 30 days before you need to, you know, avoid a foreclosure sale from happening. That's not okay, because it to do it right, to do it well, you really need several months of lead time, because there's so much that goes into the bankruptcy process, um, and so many things to think through. But technically, it does just take the filing of a document to start. We call it the bankruptcy petition, to start the bankruptcy case. And that then automatically, that's why it's the automatic stay, it automatically prevents creditors from taking action to collect their pre-petition debt, to take any negative actions against the hospital's property. Um, so the filing of the bankruptcy petition does that. So the debtor does become what's called a debtor in possession. And all that means is that the debtor is still in control of its business, and it is entitled to operate in the ordinary course of business, pretty much as if, with certain limited exceptions, as if the bankruptcy had never been filed. So the hospital continues to manage itself and operate business as usual. And this is so important, because I feel like a lot of people, that may be why they wait so long before talking to a bankruptcy attorney, because they think that bankruptcy equals shutdown. Bankruptcy equals we're done. And it's not until we have no other options that we should go see a bankruptcy professional. Well, I'm here to say absolutely not. Bankruptcy can be a real tool to have you keep going. So this slide also mentions some of the duties of a debtor in possession. Yes, you have to account for all your property. So, we always say that the paperwork that you have to fill out as a debtor in possession, it's a little bit like tax returns on steroids. We have to file schedules with the bankruptcy court that list all of your assets, all of the hospital's liabilities, a lot of reports on, how the hospital has operated over the last few years, and on an ongoing monthly basis. Monthly reports have to be filed with the bankruptcy court that show expenses and revenues, profit, just how the company is doing. Which is very, very, it's for a hospital. We always recommend, and this is one way, Claire and I have worked together before, hospitals to have not just the attorney, but also a financial advisor, who is able to help the hospital provide the attorney with the necessary financial information that the bankruptcy court and the bankruptcy players are going to want to see. And that can really release a lot of strain that would otherwise be on your in-house accounting team, because they're already busy, right, doing their normal accounting functions, their normal AP functions, their normal AR functions. and your CFO is already pretty busy doing all of that, if I have to then take up a lot of their time doing the additional reporting necessary for the bankruptcy process, that can be burdensome. So again, one of the things I said, you can't wait to do this process until you've run out of all of your cash, is because it's probably not just an attorney that you would need to hire. You'd probably also need a financial advisor. And why that's also important is that throughout the bankruptcy process, there may need to be testimony about certain issues that the judge is going to want to hear about. And so that financial advisor, who is often very experienced in providing the type of testimony that bankruptcy courts are and bankruptcy judges are used to hearing, they can, really provide that testimony experience, and it's a lot less burdensome on the chief administrator of the hospital, right? Who will have to, play a role in the bankruptcy, but if they are, armed at the hip with someone with the financial and bankruptcy experience from a hospital operator slash financial perspective, that can be a lot easier. I did want to also mention that one player in a Chapter 11 for a hospital is always the um, um, healthcare ombudsman. Because one of the most important things for the bankruptcy court is this hospital able to provide care, appropriate care to the patients? And is there, any concern that the hospital's financial distress is, decreasing the level of patient care to an unacceptable level? And so, because lawyers don't know the answer to that, the court doesn't care what I think about that. The court wants to hire and make sure a healthcare ombudsman who is trained in the level of care that's appropriate in distress situations would be reporting to the court on that. So we'll go to the next slide. I know we have about 10 minutes left before questions, so I want to make sure I get through all these slides. Although a lot of these things I think I've already talked about a little bit. This slide just really goes through some of the problems that are typical that can be addressed in a Chapter 11. And, kind of the solution. One of these that I haven't really talked about yet is the need for financing, additional financing. So sometimes, your major secured creditor who has been providing operational capital, they say, no, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. You haven't really kind of proven yourself as a worthy partner. I want to kind of get out of this space. And so you can sometimes get what's called debtor in possession, DIP financing, debtor in possession financing. And what bankruptcy allows that to be possible because there is a code provision that allows debtor in possession financiers to prime pre-petition creditors that are, basically get ahead of them in priority if the prior pre-petition secured creditor is not willing to continue to fund post-petition. And so a lot of times finance folks are willing to lend to an organization, but not in a subordinate position to prior pre-petition creditors. But if they can come in ahead, they'd be happy to continue funding. And so that's one benefit that I don't think I've talked to about. But the rest of these, I think we've talked about at different points in the discussion. So we can go to the next point. Oh, yes. So I talked a little bit about this. The whole goal of the restructuring Chapter 11 is to prepare and negotiate, ideally, a plan of reorganization for the entire organization that shows how you are going to treat each class of creditors. And so the plan has to designate the class of creditors. And usually there's one class for all your unsecured claims. And then there's a class for your priority claims, which the bankruptcy code tells you what are priority and what are not. But specifically, that's really your tax claims, your government claims. A lot of those are priority. And then secured claims. So those are your creditors that are secured by your accounts receivable, by your property, by your, your equipment, all those things. And so they all have to be treated specifically. And the bankruptcy code gives you the guardrails of how you can treat them. And as this slide says, you have about 120 days after the petition date to have the exclusive right to file the plan. So none of your creditors are allowed to file the plan. You have the exclusive right to file the plan. And it's not uncommon, especially in these complex Chapter 11s, to have that 120-day period extended as you negotiate with your creditors. Because the ideal world is to have all of your creditor classes vote in favor of the plan, and that makes confirmation of that plan much easier and less time consuming and less expensive. We have a saying in our world: pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. So the goal I always have as a debtor's attorney is to pay back creditors to the extent I can without compromising the ongoing feasibility and success of the organization. Because that actually is one of the requirements of a Chapter 11 plan, that it be feasible, that I be able to show the court that more likely than not, this plan will succeed. So I think that's about that. Oh, yeah. So this just gets into the requirements, some of the requirements for confirming a plan of reorganization. There are 16 of them, some of the most important of which are listed here. The first one I mentioned must be feasible. It must be filed in good faith. That's a pretty easy one, especially for a hospital. People aren't really doubting a hospital's desire to reorganize in good faith. The last two are a little more complicated. The best interest of creditors test just means that if we were to liquidate everything today, like let's just say you were in that kind of hypothetical Chapter 7 liquidation, what would creditors get from that? And this Chapter 11 plan that you've proposed must convince the court that this plan is paying creditors more than they would get in that hypothetical Chapter 7. That's usually pretty easy because a dead hospital is usually not very valuable. So I think we can usually show that that's being met. And then the absolute priority rule is really only an issue if in a for-profit hospital. Because nonprofits do not have to worry about this test, but or nonprofits don't have to worry about it. For-profits do, and basically what it means is that the entity that owned the equity in the hospital, they're not allowed to retain their interest in the hospital if other creditors, like unsecured creditors, are not paid in full, unless they essentially buy back that equity. So that's what the absolute priority rule says. If you're trying to retain equity, unless you have, of course, the consent of your constituency. These are all the tests that, you have to meet. Of course, if everybody agrees, you can do whatever you want. The judge is not going to worry about that. And yeah, if everyone agrees. But yes, as I said before, the idea is that this confirmed plan is the new binding contract between you and all of your creditors. Um, I think that's all on that slide.
And now we'll jump into kind of the key takeaways here. But before that, we've got our final polling question. If, after this presentation, if you were a distressed hospital, how likely would you be to consider Chapter 11 bankruptcy as a strategic option? Yay, A, yes, we would explore. B, yes, would explore, but only in extreme circumstances. C, no, we would look at other options, but not bankruptcy. And D, unknown. I'll let people have a few moments to fill that out. So I think we have about 2/3 who think yes, they would explore, and about 1/3 that said no, they'd look at other options. But no one said unknown, which is great, which means we've done our job. So a couple key takeaways here that we want to highlight. The first being know your organization's risk profile. I'm sure if you've been with us today, you've heard that multiple times. Make sure you understand what's going on at your organization. Make sure you're looking at it at a year-over-year basis, not in a silo and over 3 to 5 years. Good management alone may not save a distressed hospital. There are times where performance improvement is not all that can be done to save an organization, where no matter how much performance improvement you do, you're still at that level where you're too distressed and you need to come up with another option to right size your organization. And what I'd add to that too is, it's a lot easier to have Chapter 11 bankruptcy and restructure a hospital than it is to completely close a hospital and relinquish potentially a critical access hospital provider number and or license. You'd jeopardize retaining your critical access hospital status if especially if you're grandfathered in. They've changed those regulations, so it's a lot harder to reopen a closed hospital. So restructuring is the better option at the end of the day than closing your organization with the hopes of reopening it. And Jennifer, I don't know what you'd add to this as well.
Yeah, and just thinking about that polling question, I think that's accurate in the fact that, actually pulling the trigger on a Chapter 11 is done in extreme circumstances. Like, we are not advocating for a Chapter 11 to be used in anything but extreme circumstances. But I think the key thing to remember is you need to come to see a restructuring professional, not when the extreme circumstances get there, but when you can foresee that the extreme circumstances are coming, right? So you definitely do not pull the trigger until the options are such that you need to do that. But having it as an option in the back of your mind and talking to professionals, that's something that I think people need to do long before they think they need to. Because if you're doing the right kind of forecasting, that, or you need to be in a position to know what your runway is, and if things don't change or if things don't improve, where you're going to get there. And so I'm glad now that that I saw in that poll that people are going to consider bankruptcy as an option. And I'm not going to take it personally about the extreme circumstances, because that's right, bankruptcy is not easy. It's not for the faint of heart.
Awesome. Well, with that, we'd like to open up our kind of Q&A chat. to folks. If folks have any additional kind of questions that they'd like to pose to Jennifer or myself, happy to answer them. And it looks like we've already got a couple coming in. All right, Jennifer, this one looks like it's for you. How do fiduciary duties of hospital leadership change when a hospital becomes financially distressed?
Oh, yeah. So I think an important part to remember with any distressed organization is that um, it, that creditors and the creditors of an organization start the duties to creditors um, really start. So, I mean, hospitals are a little bit different than the typical organization because I would say the judge and even the creditors would agree that the patients deserve the most important duties. The patients are still at the heart of every distressed hospital, but I think especially in for-profits, creditors come before equity. Creditors of the hospital must be given fiduciary duties in a distressed uh, company, and so that's why sometimes board members forget that.
Great answer. Great answer. We've had another one come in. Can a hospital continue operating normally under Chapter 11?
Yes, so I definitely want to give that um, make people realize that yes, hospitals will operate. There are certain things that have to be done slightly differently, but the heart of what you do, um, the bankruptcy court wants you to keep doing it, especially when keep doing it means keeping patients safe. So absolutely.
Um, and I think the last one we have is who is actually in control during a hospital bankruptcy? Is it the court? Is it creditors? Or is it management?
So as we discussed, the management is really in control of the operation of the company. But there are certain things that require court approval during the process, such as, a sale of the debtor's property outside of the ordinary course of business. That's a big one. Or incurring debt um, by the hospital outside of the ordinary course of business. And that's kind of the key. If it's in the ordinary course of the debtor's business, the debtor can usually do it without court approval. It's those things that are outside the ordinary course that the court is going to care
Perfect. Great answer. Well, I think that is all we have time for today. Thank you all for joining for this session. Thank you so much to Jennifer, Waldrop Wall, Babcock, and Bailey. Thank you so much. This was such a fantastic session. To other folks, we hope to see you at 5 for the kind of key takeaways from all the sessions today. Thank you for sticking with us this afternoon. See you
about. Thank
all
you,
at 5.
Claire.